The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned highway as Jake Martinez adjusted his binoculars, scanning the horizon for any movement among the scattered vehicles that had become permanent fixtures of this new world. 3 months had passed since the outbreak transformed civilization into something unrecognizable, and yet here he stood with 5 other survivors who had somehow found each other in the chaos. They called themselves the Tomorrow Coalition, a name that Emily Rodriguez, their group's medic, had suggested during one of their darker moments when hope seemed as distant as their former lives. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that a doctor who had spent her career saving lives now found herself in a world where the very definition of life had been rewritten by an enemy that defied every medical principle she had learned. Behind him, Marcus Thompson worked methodically on their makeshift communication device, his engineering background proving invaluable as he attempted to boost their radio's range. The crackling static that emerged from the device had become their lifeline to the outside world, carrying fragments of voices from other survivor groups scattered across the continent. Each transmission brought both hope and heartbreak, stories of communities that had thrived and others that had fallen silent overnight. Marcus had developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between human voices and the disturbing sounds that the infected, whom they had come to call the lost, sometimes made when they encountered technology they couldn't understand but were drawn to nonetheless. Lisa Williams sat cross-legged on the ground nearby, her teaching background evident as she sketched detailed maps and strategic plans in a worn notebook she had salvaged from a school library weeks ago. Her analytical mind had become their compass in this new world, helping them navigate not just the physical dangers but the complex social dynamics that emerged when strangers were forced to depend on each other for survival. She had developed a theory that the lost retained some fragment of their former humanity, observing patterns in their behavior that suggested memory echoes rather than pure mindless hunger. This controversial perspective had sparked heated debates within their group, but Lisa's observations had also led to successful evasion strategies that had kept them alive when more aggressive approaches had failed other groups they had encountered. David Park, barely 18 and the youngest member of their coalition, possessed an uncanny ability to move silently through dangerous territory. His youth, which had initially made the others protective and cautious, had proven to be one of their greatest assets. David could slip between the lost undetected, gathering crucial intelligence about their movements and discovering resources that would have been impossible for the others to reach. His optimism remained surprisingly intact despite everything he had witnessed, and his presence reminded the group daily that they were fighting not just for their own survival but for the possibility that young people like David might have a future worth living. Rebecca Johnson, whom everyone called Becca, had transformed from a small-town librarian into their supply specialist and strategist. Her methodical approach to cataloging and rationing resources had extended their survival far beyond what should have been possible with their limited supplies. More importantly, Becca had developed an informal network of communication with other survivor groups, trading information and resources through carefully planned meetings that had begun to form the backbone of a larger resistance movement. Her quiet leadership style complemented Jake's more direct military approach, creating a balance that had prevented the internal conflicts that had torn apart other groups they had encountered. The abandoned school they had claimed as their temporary base sat on a hill overlooking the valley, providing them with excellent visibility while offering multiple escape routes if their position became compromised. Jake had chosen this location specifically because it represented something hopeful, a place where the future had once been shaped and where, perhaps, it could be shaped again. The empty classrooms and hallways served as constant reminders of what they had lost, but also of what they were fighting to reclaim. Each member of the Tomorrow Coalition had lost family, friends, and former lives to the outbreak, but together they had discovered that loss could become the foundation for something stronger than what they had before. As the morning progressed, Marcus's radio finally captured a clear transmission from a group calling themselves the Northern Alliance, claiming to have established a secure zone with over 200 survivors. The message included coordinates and an invitation for smaller groups to join their community, but it also came with warnings about increased lost activity along all major routes. Jake studied the faces of his companions as they absorbed this information, seeing the same mixture of hope and apprehension that he felt. The decision they made in the next few hours would determine not just their immediate fate, but whether their small coalition would become part of something larger that might actually have the power to reclaim their world from the lost. The debate that followed Marcus's radio discovery stretched well into the afternoon, with each member of the Tomorrow Coalition weighing the risks and benefits of attempting to reach the Northern Alliance's coordinates. Jake found himself torn between his military instincts that favored cautious reconnaissance and his growing understanding that their small group couldn't survive indefinitely on their own. Emily had spread out her medical supplies on one of the school desks, taking inventory while listening to the discussion, her practiced hands automatically organizing bandages and antibiotics as her mind processed the implications of joining a larger community. The promise of real medical facilities and proper surgical equipment was tempting beyond measure, especially when she considered how many people they might be able to help with adequate resources, but her experience treating refugees had taught her that large groups also meant complex politics and potential conflicts that could turn deadly without warning. Lisa's analytical approach had led her to create a detailed risk assessment chart, comparing their current situation with the potential benefits and dangers of the journey north. Her research into the transmission's origins had revealed inconsistencies in the background sounds and signal strength that suggested the Northern Alliance might not be exactly what they claimed to be, but she also recognized that remaining isolated would eventually prove fatal as their supplies dwindled and winter approached. David had volunteered immediately to scout ahead, his youthful enthusiasm undeterred by the obvious dangers, but the group had collectively decided that splitting up would be too risky until they knew more about what they might encounter. Marcus continued monitoring radio frequencies, hoping to intercept additional communications that might provide clearer intelligence about the Northern Alliance, while Becca methodically packed their essential supplies into portable bundles, preparing for either a quick departure or an extended siege depending on what the group ultimately decided. The decision was made for them when David, who had been keeping watch from the school's roof, spotted smoke rising from a location approximately 3 miles to the northeast. Through Jake's binoculars, they could see the unmistakable signs of a firefight. Muzzle flashes, scattered figures running between abandoned vehicles, and the distinctive shambling movement of lost drawn by the commotion. Marcus quickly adjusted their radio to scan for emergency frequencies and picked up desperate voices calling for assistance. A group of survivors who identified themselves as the Valley Creek community reporting that they were under attack and running low on ammunition. The transmission included children's voices in the background, a sound that hit each member of the Tomorrow Coalition like a physical blow as they remembered their own losses and the innocents they had been unable to save during the early days of the outbreak. Jake felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders as he watched his companions' faces, knowing that whatever decision he made would define who they were as a group and what principles would guide them moving forward. Emily was already checking her medical bag, her instincts as a healer overriding concerns for personal safety, while Marcus had begun calculating travel time and optimal approach routes. Lisa's strategic mind was clearly wrestling with the tactical implications of engaging in combat when they were already planning a dangerous journey, but David's expression showed no hesitation whatsoever, his youth and idealism demanding action regardless of the consequences. Becca, ever practical, was quietly redistributing their supplies to ensure they could move quickly while maintaining enough resources to help any survivors they might rescue, her librarian's organizational skills adapting seamlessly to the harsh realities of their new world. The journey to Valley Creek became a careful balance of speed and stealth, with David ranging ahead to scout for lost while the main group followed established deer trails and abandoned farm roads that provided cover from aerial observation. As they approached the embattled community, the sounds of gunfire became more sporadic, suggesting that the defenders were either gaining control of the situation or running dangerously low on ammunition. Jake's military experience told him that arriving at the tail end of a firefight could be more dangerous than joining an ongoing battle, as both sides might be trigger-happy and quick to shoot at any new arrivals, but the increasingly desperate radio transmissions made it clear that delay could mean arriving too late to help anyone. When they finally reached a vantage point overlooking the Valley Creek position, the scene below them confirmed their worst fears and their greatest hopes simultaneously. A group of roughly 15 survivors, including at least 4 children, had taken defensive positions around a small farmhouse while approximately 30 lost pressed their attack from multiple directions. The defenders were clearly skilled and organized, but their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and several of the lost had already breached their outer perimeter. Jake realized that this moment would define everything that came after, not just for the Valley Creek survivors, but for his own group's understanding of what it meant to be part of something larger than themselves in a world that seemed determined to tear apart any hope of human cooperation. The attack on Valley Creek unfolded with the precision of a military operation as Jake coordinated their intervention using hand signals he had perfected during his army service. Emily positioned herself behind a fallen tree with clear sight lines to the farmhouse, ready to provide covering fire while treating any wounded, her medical training having taught her to remain calm under pressure even when lives hung in the balance. David used his natural stealth abilities to circle around the Lost's flank, creating a distraction that would draw some of them away from the main assault on the farmhouse defenders. Marcus and Lisa took elevated positions on opposite sides of the battle zone, their crossfire pattern designed to create confusion among the Lost while minimizing the risk of accidentally hitting the Valley Creek survivors who were desperately holding their ground behind improvised barricades. The battle itself lasted less than 20 minutes, but those minutes stretched like hours as the Tomorrow Coalition fought alongside strangers to push back the relentless advance of the Lost. Jake found himself working in perfect synchronization with a Valley Creek defender named Tom Bradley, a former construction worker whose practical knowledge of the farmhouse's layout proved invaluable in directing their defensive strategy. The Lost, driven by their inexplicable hunger and attracted by the sounds of combat, showed their typical disregard for personal safety, throwing themselves against fortified positions with a persistence that would have been admirable in any other context. Emily's medical expertise proved crucial when she managed to save the life of a young Valley Creek survivor named Ashley Roberts, whose severe bite wound would have meant certain death without immediate treatment and the precious antibiotics Emily had been carefully rationing for emergencies. As the last of the Lost fell silent, the exhausted defenders emerged from their positions to discover that their rescuers were not the reinforcements they had been expecting. Tom Bradley explained that Valley Creek had been in communication with a group calling itself the Northern Alliance, which had promised to send a relief force that morning but had never arrived. Marcus immediately recognized the problem when he compared the radio frequencies and call signs, realizing that someone had been intercepting and possibly falsifying Northern Alliance communications for unknown purposes. The implications were chilling because it suggested that either the Northern Alliance didn't exist at all, or that someone was actively working to prevent survivor groups from finding each other and forming larger communities. Lisa's analytical mind immediately began processing the new information, cross-referencing the false transmission details with her growing database of survivor group communications and territorial claims. She discovered patterns that suggested multiple groups had received similar promises of assistance that never materialized, leading her to theorize that someone was systematically targeting established communities by luring away their scouts and advance parties. David volunteered to investigate the supposed Northern Alliance coordinates using his stealth skills, but Jake overruled the suggestion as too dangerous given that they were clearly dealing with an organized deception rather than simple communication errors. The mystery deepened when genuine Northern Alliance scouts arrived at Valley Creek just as the coalition was preparing to depart with the survivors who wanted to evacuate their compromised position. The real scouts, led by a former police detective named Michael Stevens and a National Guard sergeant named Patricia Gonzalez, carried proper identification and new details about survivor networks that the false transmissions had lacked. Michael explained that the Northern Alliance was indeed real and growing, but they had been struggling with someone jamming their communications and spreading disinformation designed to isolate survivor communities and prevent them from coordinating their defenses against both the Lost and human threats. Patricia revealed that the Alliance had identified at least 3 organized groups of hostile survivors who were systematically attacking smaller communities, stealing their resources, and using captured radio equipment to disrupt communications between legitimate survivor networks. These raiders had developed sophisticated tactics that included impersonating established groups, luring survivors into ambushes, and even deliberately driving lost herds toward communities that refused to surrender their supplies. The revelation that human enemies might be more dangerous than the Lost themselves fundamentally changed how the Tomorrow Coalition viewed their situation and their responsibilities to other survivors. The integration of Valley Creek survivors with the Tomorrow Coalition created both opportunities and challenges as their combined group now numbered over 20 people, including medical expertise from Emily and Tom's construction skills that could prove invaluable in building fortified positions. Michael and Patricia shared detailed maps showing a network of allied communities stretching across 3 states, connected by secure communication protocols and mutual defense agreements that had successfully repelled both Lost hordes and raider attacks. The promise of joining something larger than themselves was tempting, but Jake insisted on verification procedures and gradual integration rather than immediate relocation, having learned that survival in this new world required balancing trust with careful preparation for betrayal. The integration of their enlarged group created tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface since the Tomorrow Coalition first formed, and these conflicts erupted into open disagreement when they reached an abandoned shopping complex that offered multiple strategic options for their next move. Jake favored establishing a temporary base in the complex's anchor store, using its multiple exits and clear sight lines to create a defensive position while they verified the Northern Alliance's legitimacy through extended radio contact and reconnaissance missions. Emily strongly disagreed, arguing that their primary responsibility was to reach the Alliance's medical facilities as quickly as possible, especially since several of the Valley Creek survivors needed treatment that exceeded her field capabilities, and she worried that every day of delay increased the risk of losing people they could save with proper equipment and supplies. Marcus found himself caught between these positions while dealing with his own growing concerns about the communication equipment they had recovered from the raiders' abandoned vehicles, sophisticated gear that suggested their enemies possessed resources and technical expertise that far exceeded what most survivor groups could access. His engineering background told him that reverse engineering this equipment could provide crucial intelligence about raider operations and possibly allow them to disrupt their communications, but the process would require weeks of careful analysis that the group couldn't afford if they were committed to reaching the Northern Alliance quickly. Lisa supported Marcus's position, believing that understanding their enemies was more important than rushing toward uncertain allies, and she had developed detailed plans for using the shopping complex as a research facility where they could analyze raider tactics and develop countermeasures that could benefit all survivor communities. David's youth and optimism led him to propose a completely different approach, suggesting that they should split into smaller teams to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously, with some members escorting the wounded Valley Creek survivors to the Alliance while others remained to investigate the raider threat and establish a permanent base of operations. His suggestion sparked heated opposition from Jake, who insisted that dividing their forces would make them vulnerable to the coordinated attacks that had destroyed other groups, but David argued passionately that their enlarged numbers actually made such division possible for the first time since the outbreak began. Tom Bradley and the other Valley Creek survivors found themselves in an impossible position, grateful for their rescue but uncertain whether their voices should carry equal weight in decisions that would affect everyone's survival, especially when their local knowledge of raider activity patterns contradicted some of the assumptions the Tomorrow Coalition had developed about enemy capabilities. The debate might have continued indefinitely if Patricia Gonzalez hadn't detected incoming radio transmissions that indicated a large raider force was converging on their location, apparently drawn by the communications traffic generated during their extended discussions about strategy and objectives. Michael Stevens immediately began coordinating defensive preparations while Jake realized that their arguing had compromised operational security by keeping their radios active too long in one location, a mistake that could prove fatal if the raiders possessed direction-finding equipment sophisticated enough to track their broadcasts. Emily quickly began triaging the wounded for potential evacuation while Marcus worked frantically to encrypt their remaining communications. But the intercepted raider transmissions made it clear that they had perhaps 30 minutes before hostile forces would arrive in overwhelming numbers. The crisis forced an immediate recognition that their survival depended not on choosing the best individual strategy, but on implementing a coordinated response that utilized everyone's strengths while minimizing their collective weaknesses. Lisa's analytical skills proved crucial in developing a rapid evacuation plan that incorporated elements from each of the proposed strategies, using David's scouting abilities to identify safe routes while Marcus coordinated communications security and Emily managed medical priorities. Jake's military experience became the foundation for tactical coordination, but he consciously incorporated input from Tom Bradley's knowledge of local terrain and Patricia's intelligence about raider capabilities, creating a leadership structure that emphasized collaboration rather than individual authority. The successful evacuation of their entire group under pressure demonstrated that their combined capabilities exceeded what any of them could have achieved alone, but it also revealed how close they had come to destroying themselves through internal conflict rather than external threats. As they regrouped at a secondary location several miles away, Jake addressed the group with a recognition that their unity was both their greatest strength and their most fragile asset, requiring constant attention and mutual respect rather than the casual assumption that shared dangers would automatically create shared purposes. The experience had taught them that survival in their new world required not just the ability to fight external enemies, but the wisdom to prevent their own fears and disagreements from becoming weapons that their enemies could use against them, and this lesson would prove crucial as they faced even greater challenges in the days ahead. The discovery that would change everything began when David, during a routine scouting mission near an abandoned medical clinic, reported hearing what sounded like someone calling for help from inside the building, but with speech patterns that seemed somehow wrong in ways he couldn't immediately explain. Jake's initial instinct was to assume that David had encountered another survivor in distress, but Lisa's growing expertise in lost behavior patterns made her suspect that something far more significant might be occurring, especially since the clinic's location and the nature of David's description matched several theoretical scenarios she had been developing about the infection's progression and potential variations. Emily insisted on accompanying the investigation team despite the obvious dangers, her medical training making her uniquely qualified to assess whatever they might find, while Marcus brought specialized recording equipment that could document any unusual phenomena for later analysis by the growing network of researchers among the Alliance communities. When they approached the clinic, the voice became clearer but also more disturbing, as it carried the distinctive vocal patterns of human speech while incorporating the repetitive, almost mechanical qualities they had learned to associate with the Lost's attempts to communicate with each other. The speaker appeared to be a middle-aged woman who had been a nurse at the clinic, still wearing her scrubs and identification badge, but her movements combined the purposeful coordination of human behavior with the unsettling persistence that characterized the infected. Lisa immediately recognized that this individual represented something entirely new in their understanding of the outbreak, as she displayed clear evidence of retained memory, emotional responses, and problem-solving abilities while also exhibiting the physical changes and behavioral compulsions associated with advanced infection stages. The woman, whose badge identified her as Karen Mitchell, responded to their cautious attempts at communication with a mixture of relief and confusion, explaining in halting but coherent sentences that she remembered being attacked but couldn't understand why her thoughts felt different and why she experienced overwhelming urges to seek out other people in ways that frightened her. Emily's medical examination revealed that Karen's infection had progressed differently than any case they had previously encountered, with the characteristic physical changes occurring more slowly and selectively, leaving her cognitive functions largely intact while altering her sensory perceptions and social instincts. Marcus's recordings captured detailed conversations in which Karen described her subjective experience of the infection, providing unprecedented insight into the psychological and neurological effects that had remained mysterious since the outbreak began. Lisa's theories about retained humanity among the Lost suddenly gained credible support as Karen demonstrated that the infection might not represent complete cognitive destruction but rather a fundamental rewiring of human consciousness that could potentially be understood, predicted, and possibly even reversed under certain circumstances. Karen explained that she could sense other infected individuals in ways that normal humans couldn't, describing a form of nonverbal communication that helped coordinate group movements and shared awareness of threats or opportunities. More importantly, she retained emotional connections to her former life and expressed genuine distress about the actions she felt compelled to take while under the infection's influence, suggesting that the Lost might be prisoners within their own transformed minds rather than simply mindless predators. The implications of Karen's condition extended far beyond academic understanding when she revealed that the clinic contained research data from the early days of the outbreak, including patient records and blood samples that had been preserved in laboratory freezers that were still functioning on emergency power. Emily recognized the potential value of this information for developing treatments or vaccines, but she also understood that Karen's unique status as a conscious infected individual made her an invaluable source of intelligence about Lost behavior patterns, migration routes, and the mysterious coordination they had observed among large groups. David's natural empathy allowed him to establish the strongest communication bond with Karen, and she began sharing detailed information about the internal experience of infection that could help them predict and avoid dangerous encounters while also identifying other potentially conscious infected individuals who might be saved. The discovery of Karen Mitchell forced the entire group to reconsider their fundamental assumptions about the nature of the outbreak and their responsibilities toward the infected, as Lisa's research suggested that consciousness and humanity might persist in ways they had never imagined possible. Jake struggled with the military implications of treating some Lost as potential allies rather than automatic enemies, while Marcus began developing communication technologies that might allow them to distinguish between fully lost individuals and those who retained enough consciousness to be reasoned with. The revelation that the infection might be reversible under certain conditions offered hope that had seemed impossible just days earlier, but it also raised difficult questions about the moral implications of their previous actions and the possibility that they might have unknowingly destroyed people who could have been saved with better understanding and different approaches. The breakthrough with Karen Mitchell transformed their understanding so completely that Jake found himself reorganizing their entire operational philosophy around the possibility that the outbreak might be a problem to be solved rather than simply endured. And this shift in perspective attracted the attention of Northern Alliance leadership when Marcus transmitted their findings through newly established secure channels. Dr. Amanda Foster, the Alliance's chief medical researcher, arrived at their location within 48 hours, accompanied by a full research team and portable laboratory equipment that would allow them to conduct sophisticated analysis of Karen's condition while developing protocols for identifying and communicating with other conscious infected individuals. Emily worked closely with Dr. Foster to document Karen's medical status and cognitive abilities, creating detailed records that could be distributed to medical personnel throughout the survivor network, while Lisa collaborated with Alliance intelligence specialists to develop behavioral assessment tools that could help field teams distinguish between treatable and untreatable infected individuals during encounters. The establishment of their makeshift research facility at the medical clinic became the foundation for something much larger when other survivor groups began requesting access to their findings and assistance in implementing their communication protocols with conscious infected individuals like Karen. Marcus discovered that his engineering expertise made him uniquely qualified to design and build the specialized radio equipment needed to coordinate research efforts across multiple communities, and his innovations in secure frequency management allowed scattered groups to share information without alerting hostile raiders to their locations or activities. David's natural ability to communicate with Karen led to his development of standardized interaction procedures that could be taught to other survivors, creating the first systematic approach to peaceful contact with infected individuals who retain their humanity. The transformation of their small coalition into a leadership organization within the Alliance occurred gradually as word of their success spread through the survivor network, bringing requests for training, equipment, and direct assistance from communities across the region that had encountered their own potentially conscious infected individuals but lacked the knowledge or resources to attempt communication safely. Jake embraced his emerging role as a coordinator for these activities, using his military background to organize training programs that taught other groups how to implement their protocols while maintaining appropriate security measures against both hostile infected and human enemies. Tom Bradley's construction expertise proved invaluable in designing portable facilities that could be rapidly deployed to establish research outposts, while Patricia Gonzalez contributed her law enforcement experience to developing security procedures that protected researchers without compromising their humanitarian objectives. The most significant breakthrough came when Karen helped them locate and successfully communicate with a group of 12 conscious infected individuals who had been living in an abandoned warehouse, maintaining their facility and even attempting to grow food despite their altered physiology and psychological conditions. These individuals, led by a former teacher named Robert Chin and a retired engineer named Helen Walsh, had developed their own methods for resisting the more destructive impulses of their infection while retaining enough of their original personalities to form a functional community. The successful integration of this group into their research efforts demonstrated that conscious infected individuals could serve as bridges between human survivors and the larger infected population, potentially leading to peaceful coexistence and even collaboration in rebuilding efforts. The expansion of their communication network allowed them to coordinate the first large-scale rescue operation for newly infected individuals, using Karen's insights about the infection's progression to identify people who could still be reached before losing their consciousness entirely. Dr. Foster's research had revealed that the window for maintaining consciousness during infection was longer than previously believed, but required specific medical interventions and psychological support that could only be provided by trained teams with appropriate equipment and expertise. Emily led the medical aspects of these rescue operations while Lisa developed psychological assessment tools that could quickly identify infected individuals who were good candidates for consciousness preservation therapy, creating a systematic approach to saving people who would have been considered beyond help just weeks earlier. The success of their rebuilding efforts attracted both admiration and concern from other survivor groups, as some leaders worried that their focus on helping infected individuals might compromise traditional defensive strategies or waste resources that could be used to protect uninfected populations. Jake addressed these concerns by demonstrating that their approach actually enhanced security by reducing the number of hostile infected individuals while creating valuable intelligence assets who could provide warnings about dangerous lost herds or raider activities. The establishment of their permanent research facility, staffed by personnel from multiple Alliance communities and protected by integrated security teams that included both human and conscious infected members, represented the first successful attempt to create a truly collaborative post-outbreak institution that focused on solving problems rather than simply surviving them, setting a precedent that would influence how survivor communities approached reconstruction efforts throughout the region. 6 months after their first encounter with Karen Mitchell, Jake stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Alliance Research Center, watching the morning activities of a community that would have been unimaginable during those desperate early days when their small coalition had debated whether to trust a mysterious radio transmission. The facility below housed over 300 people, including 47 conscious infected individuals who worked alongside human researchers, medical staff and security personnel in a collaboration that had proven both the possibility and the practical benefits of integration rather than segregation. Emily moved between the medical wings with the confidence of someone who had found her true calling, leading a team of 12 doctors and nurses in developing treatment protocols that had successfully preserved consciousness in 83% of newly infected individuals who received intervention within the critical first 72 hours after exposure. The transformation of their understanding had accelerated dramatically when Lisa's behavioral research, combined with Dr. Foster's medical findings, revealed that the infection actually represented a form of evolutionary adaptation rather than simple disease, with the consciousness preservation phenomenon indicating that human minds could learn to coexist with the biological changes rather than being destroyed by them. Marcus had expanded their communication networks to include 47 alliance communities across 8 states, creating an information-sharing system that allowed real-time coordination of rescue operations, resource distribution and threat assessment on a scale that had seemed impossible when they were hiding in abandoned schools and rationing medical supplies. David had become the Alliance's primary specialist in conscious infected relations, training teams throughout the network in communication techniques while also serving as a liaison for the growing community of recovered individuals who chose to remain within Alliance territory rather than attempting to return to their former lives. The morning's most significant event was scheduled to be the first attempt at full neurological restoration for an infected individual, using a combination of Lisa's psychological techniques, Emily's medical interventions, and experimental treatments developed through collaboration with conscious infected researchers who understood the infection's mechanisms from personal experience. The patient, a young woman named Jessica Park who had been infected just 5 days earlier during a raider attack on an Alliance supply convoy, represented both the promise and the challenge of their evolving approach to the outbreak. Karen Mitchell would be leading the psychological aspects of the treatment, her unique perspective as the first successfully integrated conscious infected individual making her invaluable in guiding others through the complex process of reclaiming their original cognitive patterns while retaining the enhanced sensory abilities that infection provided. The broader implications of their success had begun attracting attention from survivor communities that had previously rejected Alliance membership, as reports of successful infection reversal spread through radio networks and personal testimonies from recovered individuals who served as living proof that the outbreak might not represent permanent global catastrophe. Tom Bradley had supervised the construction of 12 similar research facilities across Alliance territory, each designed to serve as both treatment centers and community hubs that demonstrated the viability of integrated societies where humans and conscious infected individuals worked together on reconstruction projects. Patricia Gonzalez had adapted her law enforcement experience to develop security protocols that protected these facilities from raider attacks while also establishing diplomatic relationships with neutral survivor groups that were beginning to view the Alliance as a legitimate governing authority rather than just another competing faction. The treatment procedure began at noon with Jessica surrounded by a team that included both human and conscious infected medical personnel, their combined expertise allowing them to monitor both the physical and psychological aspects of the reversal process in ways that would have been impossible using traditional medical approaches alone. Lisa's research had identified specific cognitive exercises that could help infected individuals reassert their original personality patterns while Emily's medical protocols addressed the neurochemical changes that had occurred during the infection's progression. The process took nearly 6 hours. But when Jessica opened her eyes and spoke her own name with clear recognition and normal speech patterns, the collective cheer from the observation gallery reflected not just professional satisfaction but genuine hope that they had witnessed the beginning of humanity's recovery from what had once seemed like an insurmountable catastrophe. As evening approached and Jessica continued to show stable recovery with no signs of regression, Jake gathered his original coalition members to reflect on how far they had traveled from that desperate morning when they debated whether to trust a potentially false radio transmission. The Tomorrow Coalition had evolved into something none of them could have imagined, but the core principles that had sustained them through their darkest moments remained unchanged. The belief that cooperation was stronger than conflict, that understanding was more powerful than fear, and that hope could be transformed into reality through persistent effort and mutual support. The rising sun of their new dawn illuminated a world that still faced enormous challenges, but for the first time since the outbreak began, those challenges seemed solvable rather than simply survivable.